Okay, we are live and recording. Actually, I just figured something out that we should probably address before a few people have joined already. Share, it seems like I might need to make you host as well. Because when I go to screen share, I can't then see like the chat or anything. So when I'm putting up the slides, I can't see the controls in Zoom, it appears.
Oh, okay.
Let me just double check that real quick. 1 second.
Okay.
Let's try that. Oh, never mind. I can. Okay.
Okay,
It's
great.
it's limited, so we'll see how it goes. But
Okay.
So welcome everybody that has joined so far. Welcome to the Risks of Public-Private Partnerships for Toll Lanes online discussion. We'll be having probably going to start maybe 5 minutes after 6 o'clock Eastern time, just to give everyone a chance to join. So just bear with us here. Welcome everybody that's joined so far for tonight's online discussion about public-private partnerships. So we've got our panelists on, we've got some attendees so far. We're going to go ahead and wait because it's, kind of the end of the workday. People are juggling different things at home, getting dinner, all that type of stuff. We're going to wait about 5 minutes after the hour to get started. So just bear with us if you have any questions or anything you need in terms of accommodation. Just drop something in the chat and try to keep all the communication in the chat and try not to use the Q&A as much because we're just focusing on the chat this evening. And again, welcome everybody that's recently joined. This is the P3 online discussion. Sorry about the taskbar, Carol. I see your chat there. I'll try to keep an eye on that. I'm juggling many screens here, so trying to make it work for you. But yeah, please, if anyone else has any issues with what they're seeing, drop it in the chat. I'll be paying attention to the chat throughout the evening. Also, if you have any initial questions that maybe you're curious about before we get started, you can drop that in and I'll try to address those when we get to the Q&A section at the end. And just for everybody that hasn't heard yet, we'll be starting about 5 after the hour. And that's just to give everyone time to join. Looks like we've got attendees streaming in a few every minute here. So we'll start in a few minutes. Okay, we're about 2 minutes away from getting started with the P3 online discussion. Again, drop anything that you need us to know in the chat. If you have any questions to ask ahead of time, if anything you're curious about going into this, drop that into the chat as well. We'll try to address that at the end at the Q&A. And yeah, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. If you need to drop off really quickly or get away, get some water, go to the bathroom, this might be a good time to do that. And we'll begin right here at 6:05. So talk to you in a moment. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the training, the online discussion. We're calling it the risks of public-private partnerships, or P3s, or also PPPs for toll lanes. This event this evening is hosted by Don't Widen 270, Citizens Against Beltway Expansion, the Maryland Transit Opportunities Coalition, Our Revolution Maryland, Our Revolution Prince George's, and In the Public Interest. We all just want to thank you for joining. It's a week out or less than a week out from a pretty important day in American politics, the election. So we know time is limited and there might be maybe a little bit more important things that you'd like to be up to this evening on top of juggling everything with the pandemic and work and family and all of that stuff. So a huge thank you and gratitude for joining us this evening, especially on short notice. We're going to try to get you out of here or finish up at by 7:30. We are scheduled to go to 8 o'clock Eastern time if needed. So if there's a pretty good discussion in the chat and we have some good questions that people want answered, we're willing to stick around for that long. But we're, want to honor everybody's time and try to finish up and wrap up by 7:30. Just to introduce the panelists this evening, I'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll kind of start to jump in. I'll talk about a little logistics as well. But first, the first panelist is Ben Ross, and he chairs the Maryland Transit Opportunities Coalition. He also has written a book called Dead End, Suburban Sprawl and the Rebirth of American Urbanism. Many of you probably know Ben through the Maryland Transit Opportunities Coalition and his kind of longtime efforts on this particular project. And he's going to be bringing project-specific knowledge and insight about the Maryland toll lane expansion project. We're also going to hear from Cher Habibi, who's the Research and Policy Director of In the Public Interest, and my colleague. And then myself, my name's Jeremy Moeller, I'm Communications Director of In the Public Interest. And Cher and I are going to be talking a little bit more broadly about public-private partnerships, not only in Maryland, but nationally, and then also maybe even internationally, some of the things that we've seen as we've studied public-private partnerships. And I'll just quickly talk about who In the Public Interest is. We're a national nonprofit think tank that studies public goods and services like public-private partnerships or infrastructure. And we also advocate for a government that works for all of us. Logistically, really quick, try to keep, I see a question there I'll quickly address. Yes, this is being recorded. So you'll be able to see a recording of it afterwards. We'll send that out to everybody that's registered. In terms of questions, please try to keep that into the chat. I know there's a Q&A function, but because we're kind of limited on resources and eyes here, I'm going to try to keep eyes on the chat and collect questions over time, and then try to address as many as we can when we get to the Q&A, which is going to be after our sort of presentation here. And then if you have any other issues, just drop that into the chat and I'll try to address that as well in terms of accommodation. If you're not seeing something, because we're doing the screen share this evening, please let me know and I'll try to address that. But bear with me because I am kind of trying to keep track of questions and run the slideshow and speak and all these things. So I'm going to start off with moving to a slide where I'm going to start us off, and then we'll kick it over to Ben briefly. So first off, I just want to explain to you why we're here and what you're going to learn tonight. And first of all, our goal, our number one goal, at least in the beginning of the presentation, is to explain what a public-private partnership or a P3 is. Public-private partnership is a term that's used pretty broadly across mainly state and local government. And you might hear it in all kinds of different situations. It's kind of hard to tell what it is. So we're going to dig into exactly what we mean by that when we're talking about infrastructure and we're talking about toll roads. We're also going to talk about some of the red flags or dangers with P3s that we see across the board in many P3s. That is that they are expensive and sometimes extremely so for the public or for taxpayers. They're risky and they're secretive or opaque. It's hard to get information about them, which you're going to hear about from Ben in this particular case. Also, we're going to bust some myths about P3s. There's a lot of chatter about P3s, particularly from the growing P3 industry, about how there's really nothing bad about them. They're all good. We're going to bust some of those myths. And then we're going to talk about what you can do about it. And we're actually going to have a call to action, which I'm going to bring up kind of early in the process here in terms of a website, an action network form that you can go to and drop in your information and send a letter. And Ben will explain that a little bit more when we get there, but we'll also do that at the end as well if you miss it. I'm going to kick it over to Ben, though, first to give us sort of a kind of general picture of the Maryland Toll Road P3 plan and the proposal and where it's at right now, just so we're all on the same page before we start to talk about public-private partnerships in general. So Ben, just make sure you unmute yourself.
I know most of the people here are familiar with this project, so I'll just go through this very briefly. 3 years ago, Governor Hogan proposed a plan to build 2 toll lanes in each direction on the Beltway in Maryland, on the entire length of I-270, and on Baltimore-Washington Parkway. The plan has evolved, and Baltimore-Washington Parkway seems to have dropped out because the Parkway belongs to the federal government, and the Maryland congressional delegation has opposed transferring it to the state. So at this point, it consists of the entire Maryland side of the Beltway plus all of 270 is still the overall plan. And this is proceeding on 2 tracks. An environmental study track, which is required by federal law, and a procurement track, which mostly follows Maryland law. The current, but neither one of these tracks at the moment is encompassing the entire project. The environmental study that's now underway is the Beltway from the American Legion Bridge, not quite all the way around, only to Branch Avenue, and up to 70 only as far as Shady Grove, the interchange with the ICC. The current status of that is that they have issued a draft environmental impact study. We are currently in the public comment period, which ends on November 9th. Once the public comment period is over, the state will revise and respond to all the comments, choose among the various options that are in the study, and issue a final environmental impact statement, which the most recent schedules issued by the state say that would be next May. But since that schedule was set, there's been slippage, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's more slippage. A separate study for I-270 north of Shady Grove is in what's called pre-NEPA activities right now. Now, as for the procurement part of it, the procurement activity that's now underway includes the American Legion Bridge, goes as far as 270, and then goes up 270 only to Shady, goes up 270 all the way to Frederick. Where that stands is they issued a request for qualifications in February. They have chosen a short list of bidders. They are now in private discussions with the bidders, which are supposed to lead to a request for proposals. The most recent schedule, again, has the contract being awarded and approved in May, but that schedule also has had some slippage. And we will see whether they make the May deadline. Okay. Right now, we are, since we're in this comment period, which is very important, we're very much encouraging people to take action. This is an action you can take now, and that's to send a comment letter, your own comments by email to the state. And we've got a page that you can do it, just type your own message in and send it. It will also be copied to Comptroller Francho, who is a key vote on the Board of Public Works that has to approve the contract. And if you write down this email address that we will also put in the chat, bit.ly/P3 letter, that'll take you to this page that makes it easy for you to write your own comment. And we very much encourage you to do that either during this talk or after it's over, if you haven't already.
Yeah. If you want to grab that link, I just dropped it a couple times into the chat. You can just copy and paste it, put it in a tab in your browser. That way you can spend a little time with it after we're done. Just really quick, Ben, what's the deadline on those letters or on that?
November 9th.
November 9th. Okay. Okay, so we're going to move on now and kind of back out a little bit and take a little bit more of a kind of technical view of what public-private partnerships are, what some of the dangers are, and also look at them nationally. And then we'll zoom back around and have Ben come in towards the end and talk again about the specific Maryland plan and what some of those particular issues are. And then we'll also have this link at the end as well. So if you're not convinced just yet, hopefully you're convinced by the end to fill that out. Let me move on. And I'm going to kick it to Cher here just to give us some basics on what a P3 is.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So I want to give a very basic explanation of what P3s are and how they differ from normal public works procurement. So in the building of infrastructure, there's kind of 5 main important activities, and you see those on the screen. There's the design of the project, the construction, which is sometimes referred to as build, the financing of the project, the operations of the, of what's built, of the public asset, and then the maintenance of the asset. And traditionally, public infrastructure is built with funding such as federal or state funds, federal or state loans, and then also tax-exempt debt raised through municipal bonds. Engineers and architects and planners design the project. Sometimes that's the public agency, but they might get, some help from some, private engineers or planners. The construction companies are always private because the governmental entity typically doesn't have like a huge construction crew just kind of sitting waiting for big projects. But the public agency finances the project, as we just discussed, and the public agency operates it and maintains it. So the term public-private partnership, or P3, it's kind of an imprecise term that's typically used to describe a project that privatizes all 5 of those activities. So typically a team of companies will design, build, finance, operate, and maintain an asset, and usually for a long period of time. It's also, sometimes it could be referred to as a DBFOM. That's another kind of term that's sometimes used, and it's just the first initial of each of those activities, and those are all privatized. So that is like just kind of nuts and bolts what a P3 is, what the model looks like. And so I want to mention that in a P3 model, the private financing component is paid back either through allowing the private entity to collect the revenue stream, such as tolls on a highway, or through a regular government payment to the private entity called an availability payment. So there's kind of 2 different ways of repayment. And in the case of toll roads, we're really dealing with that first way. The private entity is typically repaid through collection of tolls associated with that road. I'll also just mention that the cost of capital for a P3 is typically a lot more expensive than when the public agency finances the project through tax-exempt bonding, because private developers and investors demand a much higher return on investment than the interest that a public agency would pay on a tax-exempt bond. And Jeremy will talk a little bit more about how P3s are more expensive in a coming slide.
Great, thank you, Chair. And just to address Suchitra, you have that question about timing here. It looks like you're headed into a meeting with Francho, actually. Yeah, we should be able to get Ben in to talk about some of these specific issues with the Maryland project once I talk, and Cher and I talk generally speaking about P3. So we should be able to do that before 7 p.m. So yeah, that was the sort of the nuts and bolts of what a P3 is versus a traditional procurement. I'm going to talk a little bit about in terms of politically, and then sort of what we've seen in a number of cases, some of the trends, some of the threads, the common threads that we see in these deals. The first thing is to know that a public-private partnership is a form of privatization. And that is, in our definition, that means giving control of a public good, public service, or an asset, like a toll road, to a corporation or other private entity. Infrastructure, particularly transit, is a public good. That's something that all of us rely on at some point to be able to get to work, to be able to get to the doctors, the grocery store, et cetera. It makes our communities better. So therefore, it's a public good. And when you're handing over some aspect of that to a corporation or a private entity that then has a say over that public good, that is privatization. You might have heard of private prisons. That is, companies that are for profit running jails, prisons, detention centers. This is another form of that. The second thing to know is that public-private partnerships are expensive, and they're an expensive alternative to that typical method that state and local governments use to build things using cheap municipal bonds. And that's what Cher was talking about. The traditional route is cheap because the municipal bonds are tax exempt for federal taxes. And with interest rates so low right now, right, they're particularly cheap. A P3, what makes it expensive is a P3, you're essentially borrowing the money directly from private investors rather than going through the bond market. And you're sidestepping that traditional democratic process, that procurement process that is usually used to build a road in this case. So when you go to these private investors, they're looking for a return. They're only investing in, say, a toll road here because they want a good return on their investment. So essentially the public is subsidizing that return or that profit for those investors. So that money is going to come out of public budgets, and it's going to head to these private investors that are upfronting this capital to build this. And they're going to make a healthy return. We'll talk about some of those percentages in a bit here. The last thing I want to say about a P3 before we get into some of the really big red flags is that they're complex. It's a contract with a team of corporations and investors rather than a contract with one construction firm, for example, or design firm that then has subcontracts. But you're working with a team of contractors. And these contracts, these public-private partnerships are hundreds and hundreds of pages long in order for the contractors to basically write in clauses and cover their bottom line to make sure that they're getting a return on their investment. There's a lot of risk in such a massive deal like a toll road of this size and magnitude. So that needs to be written into the contract to protect both from the private side, to protect their interests, and then protect from the public side our interests, right? So these can be very, very complex contracts. And then I'll talk about in a moment when you add that layer of opacity and secrecy to the process, that complexity really can become a problem because you don't know what's going to end up in the final contract. Before I get to good old Rick Perry there, I want to say, you might be asking, if you already knew about P3s, you already knew about this situation, or you're kind of hearing what we're saying here. You might be thinking, why would any state or local government do this? If it's more expensive, complex, it's a form of privatization, the public is giving up control. Why would they do it? Right? It's a perfectly reasonable question. There are a number of reasons. Public-private partnerships, relatively speaking, aren't that common in the US compared to some other countries. So there are a few of us out here that have been paying attention to public-private P3s for a while. So we're starting to pick up on some of the trends on why governments are doing this. So this isn't a sort of comprehensive answer, but simply put, P3s are shiny new toys, and public officials, as you know, like to build things They like to have the ribbon cutting ceremony where they say, I built this school or this road or this transit. And that, I'm not kind of bringing that up only cynically. I mean, it is good to have public assets, right? So it is good when our public officials deliver things for us. But they're shiny new toys that sound good on paper, but really they're sort of diverting attention away from these deeper, longer term budget issues about why we don't have funds in the first place to build the sort of transit that we might need when it comes to roads, for example. You also hear, and I think Governor Hogan did in this case, say that no taxpayer money was going to be involved, essentially that it's free money. You might hear that P3s are cheaper, faster, better, all the things that we often hear when it comes to privatization, and often things that are, when you get down into the weeds of the deal, of the contract, they actually aren't true, and they actually tend to be a little bit more ideologically motivated than motivated by truth. And then the last thing I'll say is that this P3 process, because again, it's relatively rare compared to the sort of everyday nuts and bolts building things, the traditional method at the state and local level, governments are essentially making up a new process when they go down this procurement path. And there's enabling legislation at the state level and then at the local level, and they're sort of working things out, and different states and different jurisdictions have different levels of, in terms of that enabling legislation and what the procurement method looks like. But essentially, this is a way to sidestep that traditional procurement method. And that procurement method has been developed over many, many decades, right? At the state level here. And there are different places where the public has a say, and different bodies and different representatives have a say in the process, and they get public information released. When it comes to a P3, you don't really know going in where those entry points are. There's enabling legislation that lays it out, but it's sort of something that's being made up on the fly a lot of the time. So that's another reason why, if you're thinking from the perspective of a public official, I can sidestep this process that has all these other people that have a say in what's going on, and I can try to get this thing done on my own. And I'll get us to the next slide there with Mr. Rick Perry, former governor of Texas, cutting a ribbon here. And we're going to be talking about this particular highway, State Highway 130 in Texas, that ended up being a pretty big boondoggle. But I wanted to bring him up because there's an example of someone cutting red tape on a deal that maybe looked good on paper, although we didn't know a lot about it going in. There wasn't a lot of public information released, and Cher is going to talk about that in a moment. And then pretty quickly realized that this is a pretty bad deal. But Rick went on to be Department of Energy Secretary, so it didn't really take a hit on his career. So you might also be asking, again, why are governments doing this? Well, I wanted to bring up this quote, and this is back from 2008 during the Great Recession, which kind of mirrors our economy at the moment in a lot of ways. Desperate government is our best customer. There will be a lot of desperate governments out there. I wanted to bring this up because there is an entire P3 industry, private equity firms, other financial firms, construction firms, architecture firms, and all kinds of consultants that's been growing over time. And they spend a lot of money influencing government officials to sign these deals. That's because they've raised a lot of money from private investors to look for places to put that money, like toll roads and other forms of public infrastructure. For example, BlackRock, it's a global financial firm, has been raising hundreds of millions of dollars for P3 investment, like trying to find deals like this one in Maryland to invest their money into. And if you know anything about BlackRock, it's run by a gentleman named Larry Fink, who's a close advisor to Donald Trump, and actually one of the architects of Trump's plan to push public-private partnerships through his infrastructure legislation that he's been trying to get Congress to jump on board with, rather than publicly investing in infrastructure. This would be leveraging private capital, like from folks like BlackRock and other private equity firms and financial firms. Luckily, Trump's plan hasn't come to fruition yet. You might have heard Biden joking about his infrastructure week. I think Kamala did as well in the debates about infrastructure week happening every year at the White House and no deal being, struck. So luckily that hasn't happened, but state and local governments have been nonetheless pushing these P3s. And I'm going to talk about Maryland in a moment, how Maryland is essentially the ground zero for the P3 industry right now. First, though, I want to talk, as I said, I promised I would talk about some of the red flags, some of the, go a little bit more in depth in some of the dangers here. Like I said before, private investors only invest in things that are profitable, and that's what makes P3s expensive. With traditional municipal bonds, you're going to have a really low interest rate, again, because it's subsidized at the federal level, or at least people in the investments in municipal bonds are. So that's usually 3% or somewhat lower than that in terms of an interest rate when the government borrows money that traditional way. But with P3s, what you could essentially call the interest rate, the return on investment for the investors, we've seen anything from 10% up to 25%. And that's based on actually data that's a little dated at this point. So who knows what other deals have moved outside of that range. The other thing I want to say is that the risk. P3s give corporations more leverage. They give the contractors more leverage than a traditional procurement because, again, there's a team that comes together and we've got the money. We're also going to build it. We're going to design it, all those things. We're going to maintain it. We're going to operate it depending on the style of P3. And we've seen it with the Purple Line locally. I'm sure many of you are aware that the contractor walked away because they were demanding more money, halfway through building the project. And they're able to have that leverage because it's not just like one construction firm saying, oh, we're going to walk out. Well, the state can somewhat easily, sign a new contract. This is the money. This is everything just walking out the door. So they hold that over the government and can hold us, the public, hostage. So the Purple Line is a great example of that right there in Maryland. I also wanted to mention another example, this time with toll roads. So a few years ago when Mike Pence was the governor of Indiana, he signed a similar toll road deal, wasn't as big, for I-69 and had multiple parts to it. So it was a pretty big project. About halfway through that project, the group, the financial firms that had pulled together money to invest in it, essentially went bankrupt, or they were getting close to going bankrupt. So the state decided to take it back over. And that introduced all kinds of new costs of having to take over a construction project that they hadn't planned to do. And then on top of that, analysis after the deal was signed. So this is before the financial advisors were going bankrupt. Shortly after the ink was dry on the contract, analysis showed that the original deal was actually about $138 million more expensive than if the state had used traditional public financing. So not only were they paying the premium for the P3, but then there was more risk, and the P3 essentially went bankrupt and the state had to swoop in and take it over anyway, with all the additional costs that entailed. I also wanted to, again, talk about this complexity, right? And when you have a little bit more secrecy, a little bit more opacity, it's hard to keep up with what's actually going to be inside of the contract. Let me get to my notes on that one. Many P3s actually contain clauses that give up more control of public assets. And this is that privatization angle. This is probably the prototypical P3 that we end up talking about most often. And this is in Chicago back in 2008. This is during that recession when the P3 industry was saying, look, there are desperate governments out there that need money really quickly. So we're going to go in and not necessarily this isn't a greenfield example, which greenfield is building a new piece of infrastructure. This is called a brownfield, where they're coming in and essentially buying up, or the government is selling off a piece of existing infrastructure. In Chicago, 2008, the city very quickly signed a 75-year contract with a global consortium, a big team of investors led by Morgan Stanley. And they were selling off their 36,000 or so parking meters in the city. So Morgan Stanley and these other investors were then operating these parking meters and collecting the revenue, and they're still doing that, right? It's a 70-year, 75-year contract. Now, among the many things that were wrong with that contract, it was extremely undervalued. So the city got a bad deal on that. So now Morgan Stanley is, I think they're pretty close to just being completely profit. And then there's still decades left on the deal. So all the revenue coming in is pure profit for them, beyond operating costs. But the contract also included a compensation clause. And this clause requires the city to pay penalties to Morgan Stanley and the other investors if certain events occur that adversely threaten their profits. So the investors wrote into the contract a way to protect the level of revenue and profit that they're making on it. And it's pretty smart from their perspective. So basically the city, Chicago, has to pay that private party for lost revenue resulting in any sort of decision that they make to block those parking meters. So let's say that they want to hold a street fair, for example, for a weekend, and the stage is going to be in front of a bunch of parking meters. Well, that's an additional cost because they're going to have to pay the private investors for the revenue that wasn't coming in, right? So they're paying to use their own public space in that case. Let's say they want to get rid of the parking meters and put in bike lanes or bus lanes or other sorts of transit, right? Streetcar. They're going to have to pay a massive penalty in that case because they're essentially buying out those parking meters to be able to do that. So that raises the cost of policy decisions that might be, or we know will benefit the city and the climate, right? So who knows what sort of clauses could end up in any of these P3s that we're looking at, any of these toll road P3s. I believe that Maryland does have and this was a recent change, not allowing non-compete clauses, right? So there is some protection in the enabling legislation in Maryland, but these P3s and the industry is evolving. They're always coming up with new ways to protect their bottom line. So that's something we really need to watch out for in all these P3s. Okay, I'm going to kick it back over to Cher.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just going to go through a few more harmful impact of P3s. So, Jeremy just mentioned the contract clauses that run counter to the public interest. I'm going to go through each of these. I'm primarily going to use two stories to illustrate this. One is the Capitol Beltway hot lanes in Virginia, and the other is the Texas State Highway 130 that Jeremy mentioned earlier. And so let's deal with that first issue, these contract clauses. So while Maryland's P3 law does prohibit non-compete clauses, they still allow compensation clauses, and that could look like the following. So in the Virginia Capitol Beltway example, that contract requires Virginia to reimburse the private companies whenever Capitol Beltway carpoolers using the hot lanes exceed 24% of the traffic, or until the private entity makes $100 million in profits. So let that sink in for a second. If the number of carpoolers is more than 24% of the total traffic, then they are going to have to the state of Virginia is going to have to compensate the private contractor. And that really puts Virginia taxpayers on the hook if too many carpoolers use the high occupancy lanes, because it could adversely affect contractor revenues. Even though carpooling accomplishes important public goals of cutting commute time, reducing pollution and congestion, but the contract incentivizes against that. In 2012, the Texas State Highway 130 project, that contract incentivized the state to increase the speed limit on the highway to 85 miles per hour, which was the highest speed limit in the country at that time, and actually may still be, which clearly runs counter to the concerns related to public safety. So you can see there's a picture there from the part of that road that's privatized, and you can see the 85 miles per hour speed limit. The state transportation department reduced the speed limit from 65 miles per hour to 55 miles per hour on one of the primary competing free roads that ran parallel to State Highway 130, basically trying to incentivize more drivers onto the privatized tollway. And these decisions were made to maximize usage and therefore revenue on the privatized toll road, even though those measures were unsafe. Another issue is affordability and accessibility of the road. On the Virginia Capital Beltway P3, motorists using the hot lanes were charged tolls based on the level of traffic congestion. And in exchange for financing more than 2/3 of the $1.4 billion project, the private team of companies, they collect toll revenue from that project for an 80-year period. So the hot lanes were completed in 2012, but the actual traffic ended up being lower than projections originally estimated. So as a result, the private entity faced a deficit totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. And in response to that deficit, they began charging excessive penalties to motorists who failed to pay the toll fees. And in some cases it was hundreds of dollars, in some cases it was thousands of dollars, and this resulted in a class action lawsuit against the company. That lawsuit was settled in 2016, and there were some protections against some of those excessive fees. But I should just mention that a couple weeks ago, Transurban, the company that operates the toll lanes on the Capital Beltway, confirmed that it is seeking investors to buy into the Virginia Express lanes, basically kind of take over the investor role. And although they do plan to continue to serve as operator of the road. So that's just kind of an interesting development. The third point is reduced labor standards. I don't have specific wage data for the Virginia or Texas highway examples, but we do have wage data from the privatized Chicago Skyway. And what's really interesting about this project is that the first 4 years of that contract, operating costs of that road decreased by 11% compared to the previous 4 years when the city was managing that road. And you might say, okay, that's great. The costs are reduced by 11%. But actually, when you looked at the numbers, a large part of that decrease was due to lower labor costs. So the private entity replaced city workers that had been paid at least $20 an hour with workers that were paid like $12 to $15 an hour. So significantly less, and that's actually how they were able to reduce costs, which, on the backs of people who were actually operating and maintaining that road. Less than 10 years into the 99-year deal, investors cashed in on their investment by selling the road to another consortium of companies. And then lastly, I want to touch back on that transparency point. Let's go back to our Texas State 130, State Highway 130 example. So there was a really good article that detailed the attempts of journalists to get information about that project. And specifically, they were filing open records requests to get traffic projections that were used to justify the P3 project. And the private team of companies refused to release those traffic projections, claiming that that was proprietary information and that if they released it to the public, it could help their competitors. Unfortunately, the Texas Attorney General and the Federal Department of Transportation agreed with that decision. But that information actually proved really important in understanding the viability of the project. And the viability of public infrastructure is most certainly a public concern. So in 2016, the private entity involved in the project filed for bankruptcy when revenue projections failed to materialize. So even though the traffic each year after it was built did increase a little bit year after year, it was still far below those initial projections, leading to bankruptcy. And so while we're on the subject of rosy projections and bankruptcy, let's just look at a few other examples. You know, it's really important to understand that P3 proposals are based off of revenue projections, some of which are estimates of usage patterns many years, decades into the future. And unfortunately, sometimes project developers use overly optimistic forecasts in an effort to make a deal look attractive. So first, let's look at the South Bay Expressway in San Diego, California, that opened in 2007, but that private entity had to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2010, citing traffic at less than 40% of initial projections. And in 2011, the road was sold to the San Diego Association of Governments. Similarly, the Camino Colombia toll road in Texas was foreclosed by a district court in 2003 due to vastly overestimated demand. You'll have to listen carefully. Effective revenues were only 6% of projections. That means that they were so rosy, these projections were so off, that once the road was built, actual traffic was only 6% of what they projected. And now Texas Department of Transportation owns that road. And then lastly, the Greenville Southern Connector in South Carolina filed for bankruptcy in 2010. That projection demand study, they projected or predicted $14 million in revenue. Actual revenues only reached 5.4 million. So that's a big difference between we think we're gonna have enough traffic to earn $14 million, and we actually only earned $5.4 million during that time period. And what's interesting is that study failed to notice that the road actually made no sense as an access road to local commercial developments, that the actual traffic on this road barely justified even a 2-lane road, let alone the 4-lane expressway that was actually built, suggesting that the project was completely unnecessary. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Cher. And so I realize that if Suchitra is still on, if anyone's still on, that's going to be jumping on that College Park meeting with Peter Francho. I want to try to get you some of the Maryland details, specific details from Ben here in a moment. I did want to say, though, I wanted to share this. This has sort of been happening in the background in the last few weeks. As I said before, Maryland is now sort of looked at as the ground zero. And this is public works financing, which is sort of a kind of nuts and bolts in the weeds infrastructure publication that I had never heard of before I started working within the public interest. Only people that are really kind of focused on this stuff know about it. But they recently wrote that Maryland is ground zero for the P3 industry in the United States. And that's because of this toll lane project. That's because of the Purple Line, which I'll get into in the next quote. And then that's also because of Prince George's County trying to go down this road, and it looks like they've approved it, but there's still sort of an opportunity to do something about it, using a public-private partnership to build 6 public schools, which would be the first jurisdiction in the country to do that. So Maryland is really where a lot of the action is right now when it comes to P3s. I also wanted to read this quote from Infrastructure Investor, which is another sort of publication that not many people know about unless you're into this stuff. But this was about the Purple Line failure. Even as Maryland officials insist that negotiations with the Purple Line investors are still ongoing, all that's left to do is examine the wreckage and take stock. Everyone will be asking, what are the lessons learned from one of the most spectacular P3 collapses in the US? So that just happened right here. And, Department of Transportation, Governor Hogan, they're still moving forward on trying to make this thing happen. And one of the most spectacular collapses in the US, and this toll lane project is even bigger. I'm going to kick it to Ben. We're going to get into some of the very specific details to Maryland, into the toll lane project. Let's make sure you unmute.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Going to start off with a little background here. Transurban, which is the operator of the toll lanes in Virginia, is the clear front runner to win the contract in Maryland. There's a bi-state accord that Governors Hogan and Northam agreed to last November that gives it the northbound lanes of the American Legion Bridge. And how you're going to have two different companies designing and building the northbound and southbound lanes of the same bridge. A key Hogan staffer, his former director of intergovernmental relations, is now Transurban's Maryland lobbyist. And in September, the governor took a trip to Australia and spent time with Transurban. You see in this picture, Governor Hogan and Scott Charlton, who's Transurban's CEO. Next. Now, their Virginia toll lanes are currently, well, even before COVID, they were losing money. They had raised the tolls, kept raising the tolls until the toll increases drove away more drivers, so that they lost more revenue than they gained from raising the tolls. They're now charging the maximum the traffic will bear. As of 2018, their pre-tax expenses were still 38% greater than their toll revenue. And they did a little better in 2019, but not a whole lot better. And where they are is that there was not enough revenue to pay all of the interest on their loans, let alone pay back the principal on their loans. Now, this year we've got COVID, and the effect is that the toll lanes carry less traffic. And on top of that, the tolls go down because the free lanes aren't backed up. So why is anybody going to pay a $40 toll? They have to charge much lower tolls to get anyone on their lanes. In the worst months of the pandemic, the revenue in Virginia was down 90%, and it's still down well over 50%. They're currently on a path where, as best I can figure out what I've read, they are likely to violate covenants on their bonds within some, I don't know how many months, but within months. And that starts to give the bondholders greater control over their operations. Earlier this month, Transurban announced that they're trying to sell off part ownership of those toll lanes. I could see why they would want to do that because, to stay within the bond covenants, they would have to put some money in, get money from somewhere. And if they take money from Australia, from the parent company, they have COVID problems with their toll roads in Australia too. And if they were to ever need a bailout from the Australian government, they would certainly get asked questions about why they were shipping money to the US and now coming to the Australian government for a bailout. Next. Now, for the Maryland toll lanes, the financial outlook is even worse than Virginia. The Virginia toll lanes were heavily subsidized by taxpayers. $400 million of taxpayer money was spent on building the toll lanes on the Beltway, which Transurban doesn't have to pay back. On I-95 and I-395, there were already HOV lanes that were turned over to Transurban for free. And Transurban had to add more lanes and put in the tolling equipment, but clearly that's effectively an enormous subsidy. On top of that, in Maryland, we see that due to the location of the Beltway in Rock Creek Valley, it looks like there will be around $2 billion cost of moving water and sewer pipes if they widen it. Somebody's going to pay that, and either the taxpayers or you'll see it either in your taxes or your water bills, or else you've got an enormous financial hit to the cost of building these things, which has not yet worked in. And this morning, Maryland Matters revealed that there's additional costs from all the other utilities that have also not been factored into the cost. Next. On top of that, the DEIS, the numbers in the DEIS, even without looking at any of that, show that there will be a need for subsidy. And the DEIS was jiggered to cover up that need. What the Maryland Department of Transportation did was it estimated the construction costs using the State Highway Administration's cost estimating manual. The manual says that at this point you should add 25 to 40% for contingencies. So they added the bare minimum of 25%. They left out these water and sewer pipe costs. They also leave out the northern part of I-270, which MDOT admits is a money loser. And even with all those tilts to the calculation, they still showed financial losses. So MDOT arbitrarily lowered its cost estimate. All they say about that is they lowered it based on, quote, assumed efficiencies, unquote, and they don't explain what those efficiencies are. And they have refused to reveal what the original cost estimate was. Next.
Ben, can you quickly say what DEIS stands for?
Oh, the draft environmental impact statement.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The Maryland Prince George's Park and Planning Board says that the toll lanes will need a public subsidy. And here's the letter, here's the wording from the staff report that the Planning Board approved last week. Next. On top of that, they also changed the way they're doing the procurement to favor private contractors over taxpayers. They originally proposed a competitive procurement to bid on awarding a contract to build something. And that's what, I mean, there were plenty of problems with that procedure, but at least it was a competitive, a price competition or price and financial competition. In April 2019, Transurban announced that it wasn't going to bid on the contract because the economics and the politics were too unfavorable for them. Very shortly after they said we're not bidding on their contract, they more than doubled their spending on lobbying in Maryland. Then in September of last year, Governor Hogan visited Australia and spent time, as you saw, with Transurban. In January of this year, the Board of Public Works amended the P3 process with the biggest changes hidden deep in fine print that was very hard to figure out what it meant until February, when the request for quotation for qualifications that the state issued revealed how they were changing the way the contract was going to work. Next. So the first of the two biggest changes is that there is going to be risk sharing by the state, which is going to be arranged in secret meetings with the bidders. The secret meetings are part of the P3 process in the law that the state passed 8 years ago or so, which I have problems with in general, but even worse is to say risk share. There will be sharing of risks when the governor had previously announced that no taxpayer money. Well, if the state's taking risk, that means that's a risk of paying taxpayer money. And the reason is, quote, to provide an offerer confidence that their solution may be implemented. You know, in other words, if the contractor says that if this happens, we're going to lose money, the state's going to make it up, is what this says. Next. The second big change in the procurement process was that they now go to a two-stage process where first the state picks a phased, what they call a phased developer, unquote. And that's what they're doing now and plan to sign a contract in next May. Then the phased developer designs the toll lanes. Then the phased developer and the state negotiate what they call a section contract, which is actually the contract to build, finance, operate, and maintain the project. You know, that's the contract that actually yields a profit. But where we are then is that when you're negotiating the section contract, which is the real contract, it's sole source. So the governor who's sitting there faces a choice. Either he can give in to whatever the bidder demands, because there's no competition, there are no competing bids, or he can walk away. But if he walks away, he has to admit that his grand transportation initiative has collapsed. So it really gives the private contractor the upper hand in the negotiation to a much greater degree than the original contracting method. Next. On top of that, in February, they walked back the promise of no taxpayer subsidy. The governor said no taxpayer money, but the actual legal document given to the bidders said no public funds are expected to be provided. Quite a difference. Then to make clear, all the finances and the risks are negotiated in this section contract, where the sole source negotiation gives the contractor the upper hand. Okay, I think that's my last slide.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Ben. So we're going to do this reminder about this call to action again and explain what exactly we're doing with it. And then we'll move into a Q&A. I've got 3 questions so far that I've collected. So if you've got any others, please start dropping those into the chat. Right here, though, I'm going to drop this link into the chat. And Ben, could you just explain briefly who will be getting the email when people fill this out? I think it's Peter Francho and then a few others,
the email will go, first of all, to the official Maryland Department of Transportation public comment site or address. And they are collecting comments on the DEIS, and they are legally obligated to respond to all the comments. I mean, obviously, if a lot, you know, they're going to be probably on the purple line, there were around 1,000. So they combine comments when they respond. But the the more people raise these issues, it doesn't just have a legal effect, it also has a political effect. And we strongly urge you to say in your comments that you are opposed to building toll lanes through a P3 process.
Right. And if you take this link and go ahead and it looks like someone's already signed it. That's great. If you go ahead and copy that into your browser, you can either do it now or you can save it for later. But what it does is it just asks for some contact information from you. That way I can kind of pre-populate it into an email. And then on the next page, there'll be some text that's already populated that shares some of the concerns that we've laid out tonight. You can go ahead and adjust those or give it some personal perspective if this is going to directly impact you, and then go ahead and click send. But if you want to spend a little bit more time to work on it, you can save the link as well. November 9th is the deadline. But Ben, go ahead.
I would strongly recommend that you personalize it.
Mm-hmm.
Because when they count the comments and report how many were comments they received that were against the project, that they seem inclined to not count identical comments from more than one person.
Yeah, so make sure you spend a little time and just, it's really easy in the form there, and you can change the text however you'd like. So I'm going to leave that up on the page right now, and then I'll share some of our contact information a little later, but let's go ahead and do some of these questions. So I think two of these seem like specific to Maryland. So I think maybe Ben might be the person, but the first one was, what's the real impact of MNCPPC unanimous vote against the DEIS?
It's important for several reasons. One is that comments coming from the official state and local government planning agency will be taken more seriously. Well, will be taken seriously by the federal agencies. The federal agencies have to sign off on whatever Maryland comes up with in the final EIS. And comments coming from the official state planners will get extra attention. The second is that to widen the Beltway, they need land that Park and Planning owns. And that land was purchased under the Capper-Crampton Act passed by Congress in 1930, which I'm sure all the lawyers on the call heard about in law school. But that law basically says that the land that was bought with federal grants under this law can only be used for park purposes, and under an agreement between the our Park and Planning Agency and the National Capital Planning Commission. So the Park and Planning has a strong legal position. You know, how strong, of course, you don't find out until it goes to the judge, but they have a considerably legal position to, if they don't want to turn land over to the State Highway Administration to build.
And just a follow up from myself here, Ben, are there any other bodies that have to weigh on this at this point? Is there any other say?
Well,
like that.
Anybody can submit comments. The Montgomery and Prince George's County Councils are planning to submit comments.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's the ultimate under the state, that's on the environmental approval track. There's a bunch of federal agencies that have to sign off, and ultimately the U.S. Department of Transportation. On the procurement track, the way the law is currently written, it's the Board of Public Works, which consisting of the governor, the comptroller, and the state treasurer. The state has to approve all contracts in Maryland. The state treasurer has been skeptical of this whole project. So the comptroller, Peter Francho, is the swing vote. And that's why we're asking people to, well, your letter will be copied to him too, or to his office, as well as to the Department of Transportation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you use our page, it will get copied automatically.
Mm-hmm. Great. So there was another question, and this actually isn't related to this plan. I don't know the answer to this. I'm hoping that Ben, maybe you have some insight, but someone asked why the purple line P3 went over budget.
That's a question. It was for sure part of the cause is the lawsuit that held it up. That was a completely frivolous lawsuit that happened to hit a judge whose wife was a former member of a group that would opposed, block captain in a civic association that opposed the project, and who lived diagonally across the street from the former president of Columbia Country Club. There are three other issues that have been raised by the contractors, which in my mind, well, for sure, have varying degrees of justification. And overall, the only thing I can really say for sure is that the contractors are probably, at least in court, the contractors are for sure asking for more money than they're entitled to, and the state is for sure offering them less money than they're entitled to. But it's, there's a lot of blame to go around.
Mm-hmm. There's also a question that just came in through the Q&A, and Ben, I'm going to direct this to you as well. Similar question. It's a really great question. Were there similar warning signs before embarking on the purple line?
The warning sign, there was a warning sign, which was the governor gave the contract to the bidder who had the lowest price, but finished third technically. I'd say that's a different warning sign than the one we've got here, the ones we have here, but that was warning sign. I feel like this one, really the warning signs are much worse here because you have the sole source financial negotiations, where in the purple line, you had 4 bidders very actively competing and seriously competing.
Great. So we've got another couple questions that came in. I'm going to give Ben a break for a second. Someone asked about the Prince George's County P3 plan to build schools, and they wanted someone to comment on that. So I'll give that a crack, and then I'm going to let Cher add anything, because we actually did a similar online discussion webinar a few weeks ago now. It might even been last week at this point. Everything's moving so fast and slow at the same time about that particular deal. So I'll just comment on some of the similarities and some of the differences. That's also a P3. It's in that case, not the state, but the county and the school district going directly to private investors to borrow money to build, in that case, 6 public schools. And as I mentioned before, that would be the first jurisdiction in the country to do this type of public-private partnership where they're borrowing money from borrowing private capital rather than going the traditional municipal bond route. So it's 6 public schools, the city council, or excuse me, the county council, and then the school board have both voted to move forward with that at this point. The contract has not been signed yet. There's still some time to maybe have a say and influence that decision. So if you have the ear of any of the local officials there, you might want to bring up some issues. Very similar issues in terms of it's going to be more expensive, it's more risky. And then when it comes to schools, there are also particular risks when it comes to what can be in the contract that we're concerned about. It hasn't been done in the US to date, but Canada has actually tried using or has used P3s to build public schools. And we've looked at some of those contracts or kind of read some reports about those contracts. And there are actually clauses in the P3 contracts in Canada that limit what teachers can do in classrooms. For example, in an elementary school that was built using a P3, teachers can only cover 25% of the walls with student artwork or anything. And can you imagine being in an elementary school classroom, a second grade classroom, and you've got basically bare walls? It's very sterile. It feels like a doctor's office. You don't have all the student work everywhere and all the cool stuff on the walls. They also, in that contract, didn't allow the teachers or anyone to open the windows in the school for the first year of the contract. Other contracts have included where they lease out the facilities, the school, and the sports fields back to the county or the district and community groups in order to use it after school hours. So there's sort of the private investors are monetizing the facilities when it's not being used during the school day. And all of those are ways to try to keep the building a certain way, to control the building, to control the staff in the building, to try to protect the return on investment for those investors. So it's the same dynamic, but in that case, it's in schools. In PG County, the differences are, it's not a toll road project. So it's, as Cher explained in the beginning, it's not a user fee model P3 where the revenue that's paying the investment back isn't coming through, students showing up and paying money, right? Like no one's paying a toll to go to the school. So in those sorts of infrastructure where there's not a user fee like transit or highways, they're called availability payments, essentially a lease payment that taxpayers are paying the private investors back over many decades to essentially pay that loan back to build the schools. The other thing I'll say there, though, is that it's moving very fast, much faster than this toll lane project. There's much less public input. So in that case, there isn't an opportunity to give public comments like this, like the toll lane project. There are only a few places where the school board and the city or the county council could weigh in on it. Like I said earlier, the P3 procurement process is going to be different in all the different jurisdictions because this stuff's sort of being made up as we go. P3s are relatively new and they're relatively rare in the United States. And when it comes to school, they're extremely rare. It hasn't been done in the United States yet. Cher, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that completely makes sense. I mean, just kind of to wrap it up, it's a slightly different model because of kind of how the private developers are kind of making back their money, but very similar concerns. And, ultimately it's private control over public goods and public infrastructure. So kind of just to recap what Jeremy just said.
Exactly. So I'm going to shine the spotlight on you, Ben, again. I think someone asked, what can be done in Maryland to change the P3 laws so that there will be more oversight and the governor or the Board of Public Works won't have so much control?
Yeah, there was a bill introduced in the last session by Jared Solomon, I believe, to reform it, and it did not pass. I think it's something that needs to be done, and when the legislature has the will and either has enough votes to override the governor or does something that the governor will go along with, which I don't really expect with the current governor. That's how you have to do it. I mean, what really, one of the things about this toll lane project is that the P3 law is being used in a way that was not intended when they passed the law. What they had in mind when they had passed the law was the Purple Line and the Port of Baltimore and some smaller projects. I mean, they used the P3 law to rebuild the restaurants at the rest stops on I-95, which to me is actually a much more legitimate use of it because, the State Highway Administration is not good at running restaurants. They're good at building highways. And, that's something that really makes sense to bring in a restaurant company to run the restaurants. I'm not familiar with the details of the contract, but in principle, that to me is a much more reasonable way to use it. This two-stage procurement is not what they had in mind. And the other thing is that the fact that there's ostensibly no state money going to be in there is allowing them to escape a lot of controls that the legislature and the local governments had over the Purple Line. And the law definitely needs reform, but I think we've got a ways to go before we have the will in the legislature to change it. Maybe the Purple Line will help with that.
Sorry to cut you off, Ben. I also share no pressure. Just wanted to give you an opportunity if you had anything around more oversight or any changes to P3 laws that could make the process a little bit better.
I will just say that one of the most, in my mind, one of the most important things that we can do is in a lot of these, P3 projects, and not just in Maryland, in other states that we've seen this. And this definitely seems to be the case in the PG County Schools project. There seems to be kind of let's go ahead and charge ahead with this P3 plan. And we're going to make sure that our projections or our cost analyses or whatever kind of analysis that we're doing supports that P3, option. And what we've seen is that there just isn't a developed, public sector, public option, of how do we actually, if we were going to do this way, in a non-privatized way, if we were going to actually do this in, our regular public works, way that, where we have the public agency operating and maintaining the asset, and we're using the debt that the public agency is issuing. It seems like those kind of the public option of these projects, especially when there's kind of the P3 kind of, as I use the word that that Jeremy used, kind of the shiny, the shiny toy. It seems like so much of that prep work is done to justify the P3, and there's not really a real and fair analysis to really understand whether that's actually the best choice when compared to the public option. So I just that's something that I think, not just Maryland, but kind of, overall, we kind of charge ahead, with these P3s without really and truly exploring what it would, what that other option would look like. And in many cases, I think it would be a much better option if we actually spent as much time, costing that out and figuring out the details of that plan.
Right on, right on. So we got one other question. I just want to encourage people, if they have further questions, just drop it in the chat, drop it in the Q&A. I've got them both up here. So any final questions you have, we'll try to get to those. But the question, it's funny you ask, has someone done an analysis summarizing P3 type contracts? It just seems like a new way to siphon money from the government versus just building the road by the state. And I brought up our contact information there. You'll see our website in the public interest. There are plenty of resources on there. If you go in and click on the left, the publications, infrastructure, you're going to see our different resources for public-private partnerships. I'll let Cher maybe mention a few specific ones in a moment. I also want to mention, though, that someone in the chat, if you scroll back up, I think Greg shared some reports from US PIRG and Friends of the Earth, and they were highlighting some of these particular toll road and highway deals. I-69, the one in Indiana that I mentioned earlier, Mike Pence, and I think they're called Road to Ruin and Green Scissors. I've seen some other ones in the past too, like Highway Boondoggles, I think was another one. So there's some good information in those reports too, specifically to roads. The stuff on our website is going to be a little bit more about P3s in general. And we've got plenty of guides on there. Cher, did you want to mention any in particular, or do you have any other thing you want to mention answering that?
I'll just say, kind of lastly, one of the most important things that we have found is it's really important to ask the hard questions. And it's really important to ask, when you're submitting comments, when you're talking to, decision makers, when there's public comment period or public meetings, it's really asking those hard questions to ensure that our policymakers and decision makers are really thinking through these deals. And so, kind of in that spirit, we have put together a number of guides that kind of go through kind of hard questions around P3s. And all those guides are on our website. And I encourage you to take a look at that, take a look at those publications. And they also do a good job of summarizing a lot of the problems that we see with P3s as well. So just, encourage you to take a look at that. I think they're useful resources and actual tools for engaging in these types of deals.
Yeah, and feel free to email us. We're here to try to provide information about public-private partnerships and other forms of privatization. That's really our wheelhouse. So we're kind of always ready and willing to kind of get into the weeds with you and help you try to figure something out. I want to just share a few logistic things around the recording and all that, but I want to give Ben, if you have any final thoughts, anything you want to add before people jump off. It looks like no, but.
Well, my final thought is, if you have not yet commented on the DEIS, go to that page, just sent that again in the chat, and put in your 2 cents. Nice.
Keeping us focused on the call to action. I love that. That's why we're here. We actually have another question. Are governments turning to P3s due to declining tax revenues and lack of willingness to tax large corporations and the wealthy? Wow, I'm tempted to, or I'm worried about just taking the bait on that one because I feel like it's a softball just set right up. I mean, yeah, I think, don't really have any comprehensive analysis or data on that to prove it, but my sense is that that's one of the drivers for this, that particularly when we're seeing during a crisis, right? In 2008, that quote that I shared earlier about desperate government, particularly at the state and local level, if there's no federal sort of money coming down for our not enough federal investment in infrastructure, and the state and local governments can only go into debt so much, right? They can't run deficits. So they're going to have to borrow money, and they can only borrow so much to build roads, to build water systems, to maintain those water systems, to build schools, to build all the things that we need in our communities. So then you've got this P3 industry that's coming around and lobbying and saying, we can do this with no taxpayer money. It's a shiny new object. They even try different names for it. So we're calling it a public-private partnership. That's what the industry has been calling it. But in Prince George's County, they actually haven't used that word or that phrase. They've used alternative construction financing, ACF, which is, as far as I can tell, new to me. So they're sort of repackaging this over time to try to sell it to public officials that are really just trying to get things done and built for their communities. So as I said before, I think that one of the things driving this is sort of a lack of investment in our infrastructure, of all types of infrastructure, for many decades. And what's really driving that behind the scenes is that lack of revenue that's coming in, how taxes have gone more regressive over time. And so then state and local governments have less money to work with. I think federal investment, I don't remember the exact figure on this, but federal investment in non-defense discretionary spending, which includes infrastructure, is at a historic low at this point. So that's really putting state and local governments in a bind. Add COVID to that, and we're probably going to see more of these public-private partnerships kind of sprout up around the country. Really going to watch out in the school sector, because if PG County does sign this deal, it may look good on paper at first, and then maybe the issues pop up down the road, and other counties and other districts may want to jump in on that. The P3 industry is probably going to pounce on that and really push it. So yeah, to answer your question, I think flat out yes. That was a long way of saying yes. Anyone want to add anything, Ben or Cher? That was my political rant for the evening. Okay, I think we're at the end here. You'll see our contact information there. As Ben said, I'm going to drop that link in for the letter to go fill it out if you can. I just want to, again, thank everybody for joining this evening. I know it's a really important time in the country on so many levels. We're all managing so many different things. So thank you so much. We have a lot of gratitude towards you for joining. We hope it was helpful. Just to answer the question that many people ask, we will be sending out a link to the recording. So if you missed any piece of this, or if you want to share it with anyone else, you're going to get an email at some point, probably not before the election, probably after the election, that has a link to a YouTube video that you'll be able to watch this whole thing again if you want to. To everyone saying thank you, you're welcome in the comments, and have a beautiful evening. Get in touch if you have any more questions. Good night, y'all.